Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Ducey, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webcast, Responding to Change Through DevSecOps, presented by Red Hat and Carahsoft. This event is part of the GovForward multi-cloud series. In today's world, executing on an agency or organization's mission is rapidly moving to a digital-first model. How can DevSecOps help IT organizations with this rapid shift and respond to the needs of development teams and the people the agency serves? In this panel, we will discuss this idea of digital transformation and what's required in terms of technology and culture, and discuss discuss best practices to apply DevSecOps practices to your organization. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of the platform, you'll find several icons, including the Q&A tab, which allows you to ask a question. We'll have a subject matter expert fielding your questions live in the chat, so feel free to submit questions at any point along the way. If you experience any technical difficulties, just click on the help icon and a member of our support team will assist you. So joining us today, we have Emily Fox, DevOps Security Lead for the National Security Agency. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't you give everyone just a quick introduction of your background and what you do for the NSA?
So I'm Emily Fox. I am the DevOps Security Lead for the National Security Agency. A similar job title, I guess you could say, would be almost developer advocate or security advocate. I work on identifying emerging technology trends, software development methodologies, working with open source and industry, and how we can collaborate with those partners, take the technology, make sure that it's capable of being implemented for our national security systems, as well as leading that movement forward within the National Security Agency, ensuring that all teams have equal access to DevOps practices and how we map DevOps to security. I'm also the developer security lead in an organization called DevX that's dedicated to improving the developer experience inside of NSA. So we want to make sure that all of our developers have access to all of the tools that they need to do their jobs to secure our nation's systems.
Great, thank you. And just for those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Ducey. I'm a transformation specialist at Red Hat. I help organizations really understand the processes and the change that they need to implement in their organizations, as well as the technology to really shift towards that DevSecOps model that they're wanting to move towards. And of course, all of this being in service of digital transformation. I think it's very important that you understand how the socio-technological systems your people, process, and technology, which is almost a little bit of a cliche now, but it's very, very true. So how that people, process, and technology, or that socio-technological system interplays with one another and is really important for achieving this kind of digital first model. So Emily, I know you and I have talked many times. We're actually working on an event recently, and with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and then the pandemic hit, and then our entire world changed. What do you think organizations really need to be focused on around how they achieve that digital first mission, and kind of what are the kind of the key points that they should be thinking about first as they try to achieve this digital first mission?
Yeah, so I think the hardest part and probably the most important, and we've talked about this in the past, is the culture shift associated, especially with the pandemic going on. There's a lot of businesses and organizations that were not set up to do work from home or telework, especially when you're talking about within government. Depending on what your mission is, that becomes really difficult.
Yeah,
Um,
depending upon what type of data people are working with and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And a lot of our meetings, we're used to having those in person. So getting into the cadence of asynchronous communication and asynchronous collaboration, if you don't have the tools and platforms to be able to enable that, or your culture wasn't set up to be able to allow those opportunities to exist, that becomes increasingly problematic. For teams to be able to be really successful with these transitions, they need to be open to that level of change, which is really hard, especially in government when you've had so many of these institutions around for so long and their processes and their policies are very well ingrained in the culture. It becomes very difficult to make that dynamic shift into that digital first mindset.
Yeah, and you know, not to just pick on government agencies, but I know many people who work in the commercial areas as well, where the businesses were just not set up, and people are rushing to buy laptops for employees so that they can work from home. This whole idea of working remote is new to many people. I myself have been fortunate through this whole thing in that I've worked remote for 13 years. So to me, it's second nature. But to somebody who's all of a sudden thrust in this idea of now you're working from your coffee table, and yes, now you have all these distractions around you, it can be very, very difficult and daunting. So that building that remote first culture is definitely something that a lot of organizations have had to do.
Yeah, and it's not something that happens overnight with teams. A lot of people think that they can just split the switch and make it happen, but it's something that has to be iterated over time and constantly seeking improvement.
What are your tips that you've seen work well as you've seen your teams trying to make that transition?
A lot of don't change your culture or your practices significantly. And I know I just said you have to change your culture, but what I mean by that is you can't expect to change your reporting structure. So if you've already got weekly meetings set up and that is what your team is used to, do not set up daily meetings just to make sure that you're on top of everything. Um, you want to make sure that you're not asking for anything more than what you were previously asking for. So if your regular status updates or your regular sprint planning meetings involve a certain level of conversation or they involve deep dives into the technology, your team is expecting to get that same thing out of it, and you should not be switching that up. So if you're not doing deep dives during your sprint planning or during your retrospectives, don't start doing them because your team is still trying to figure those things out. So stick with what you know from like your normal operations, but you need to transition it into that remote kind of mentality.
Yeah, and that's a good point where a lot of people might be tempted, or a lot of managers might be tempted to all of a sudden have this idea that they need to have more supervision and more meetings and more asking questions around what people are doing. But to your point, that can actually be detrimental to the team, especially early on in the pandemic when there was much more of a lockdown going on, and people were um, you had a fair amount of anxiety and stress about what was going on, and adjusting to this new way of working. So having that big change to the way people are expected to work, and having all of a sudden more meetings and check-ins and things like that could definitely be detrimental. Uh, to that end, though, I've always found more communication is better than less communication in a work from home or a work remote environment. And so, whether that's communication via Slack or Teams or whatever your chat tool might be, whether if it's via email, or whether if it's just reaching out to someone and giving them a phone call, or doing a FaceTime video chat with them, to be able to get that connection to people is very, very important. I myself, when I don't have that connection, tend to often feel like I'm working on an island, out alone by myself. And I've had situations where I'm the only employee on the West Coast or on the East Coast, and all my team is on the West Coast. And so that can be exacerbated even more in that type of situation. And so more communication often is better. You just have to be kind of cognizant of the mental load that you might be putting on someone by increasing the levels of communication.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was just talking to somebody about that today. You can't make assumptions for what knowledge people are actually getting out of the regular communications that you have. Like, typically, when we're in person and we're having conversations with somebody, they're following along in the thread. And when you change that to a digital platform, that following along in the thread, depending on what platform you're using, doesn't always work. And it could be a couple of days since then. So it's always beneficial to reiterate what it is that you are talking about originally and what it is that you mean. In this case, more information, more context around the data that you're giving somebody is really important.
Yeah. So let's kind of shift away from this idea of remote work, and let's actually talk about the topic at hand. Well, it's related to the topic at hand for sure, but as organizations have needed to find ways to serve their customer, or serve the people that they're supposed to be serving, what are your thoughts around why DevSecOps can actually make it easier to transition to this digital first model, and the idea of serving the end user?
So a lot of it has to do with the least amount of human interaction in the processes that people typically regularly do themselves. So if it is something that is a task that you constantly are doing with very little change, either you're downloading a file and you're sending it somewhere, or you're analyzing a same set of data, doing DevOps or DevSecOps, it allows you to remove that human element. So you're improving from the perspective of no more single points of failure. So if that person happens to be out sick for an extended amount of time, or they're on vacation, you're kind of sharing the knowledge and by getting it documented so that it can be automated. The other thing with that is by removing that human element, you're less likely to introduce error over time, because once you've got it documented, you can easily point to where that problem set is and make the correction, have version control associated with it so you understand who it is that made that change and when that change went into effect. And then you can start testing that process and make sure it works. So, from that perspective, just removing the human element has not only a lot of business value added, but also a lot of consistency and repeatability associated with those processes. On
Yeah,
top of, go
yeah.
ahead.
Let me just add to that real quick, and especially this idea of removing the human element, especially as a lot of organizations are short for staff for various reasons, or as the pandemic was very much in full swing, not everyone was able to come in because maybe they were sick or other things like that as well, and having that ability to have that automation take that time or take that those people hours away is very important.
Yeah, it's with that, not like the knowledge part is especially important as we continue to move more towards digital platforms and automation. Getting the knowledge written down and captured somewhere so it can not only be reviewed but it can be digested and analyzed is especially critical. There are too many organizations and too many individuals that don't understand the inner workings of their platforms or their technologies, even their business processes, because it's all kept in somebody's head. And when that person moves on, you're left with other people scrambling to pick up the pieces. When you document it and when you automate it, you're capturing that knowledge and you're carrying it forward for the next generation of your development team or your operators or even your security folks in business administration.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, it's this whole idea that they talk about in the world of site reliability engineering, this idea of reducing toil, and the manual tasks that people don't really want to do that are not rewarding for individuals, and this idea that if you can reduce by automating, reducing the toil by automating, you then free up your staff to go and work on higher level things like possibly understanding how the platform actually works so that then maybe you could actually optimize the platform, understanding the development process to help developers ship code faster and other things like that.
That's exactly right. And that's a great point. When you reduce the toil, as you said, those individuals, that time that they were regularly spending on those dreaded activities, they can actually now start dedicating those hours towards harder problems, more complex problems, or even predicting problems that the organization does not yet have. Because now they can start looking through all the automated trend analysis data that they're receiving, looking through the monitoring and through the service level tracing that's going on, and start to dig in and detect problems before they actually occur and prevent them before they happen.
So let's talk a little bit about the organization and what the organization looks like when you're adopting a DevSecOps model. Something that you talked about when you introduced yourself that I thought was pretty interesting in the way that you described the work that you do of being more of a developer advocate. I've always been a big fan of, as organizations are trying to adopt a platform such as Kubernetes or OpenShift or something like that, whatever it might be, the role of the organization changes, and the operations people aren't necessarily there to uh, just keep the lights running, but they're there to kind of be a consultative partner to help the development teams understand how to consume that platform and how to use that platform. And as you said, be that developer advocate. So maybe you can talk a little bit around how you see the organization looking when you're adopting a DevSecOps model.
So first, it looks The same, but extremely different. So you still have your individual teams, but the makeup of the teams is going to be a little bit more diverse. You're going to have developers working alongside operators, working alongside security folks. They're no longer individually siloed teams. We're not talking about like your security team is in a completely different part of the office and your developers are somewhere else. And occasionally they will bump into each other while they're getting coffee. That's not what the organization starts to look like. And it certainly doesn't involve non-managerial types managing technology products. This is an opportunity for teams to start self-organizing around their expertise, and natural leaders will start to emerge. And as well as natural leaders emerging, you're going to get individuals that are helping to educate and push those leadership principles into others and instill them. Your developers still remain developers. We don't want them doing anything beyond what we're paying them to do. I mean, certainly if they have aspirations to switch over to operations or security, we want to encourage those things. But realistically, it's not feasible to expect them to go back to school and get all the security core fundamental training that your security people have, or to go back and get full operating system certifications that your operators are having and maintaining. We want them to have knowledge of it, but not necessarily expect them to know the ins and outs. That's why we have security teams. We want them to do more partnership. That was a great point that you made, is we don't want them to think of things as being punted over an email or moved along to the next line of the queue and then they see nothing else about it. It's more of a partnership. We want teams to have an open communication and provide a level of explanation or intent around why they're doing things the way that they're doing. I see this a lot and I hear it a lot. I was actually listening to a podcast the other day that talked about security analysis. Security practitioners will usually just take a full list or a PDF file and go over to the developers and be like, you have to fix all of these things. And there's no context around them. The security folks don't understand, or the developers are looking at it like, what does this apply to? So getting to the point where you have real actionable information from the data sets that you're seeing, that's important to an organization's success and makeup. And it takes a little bit more time, but it's so much more worth it in the end because your developers and your operators and your security teams aren't spending a week playing ping pong with each other about what to do next.
Yeah, and one thing that I like that you said there is this idea of celebrating the successes and finding those people that can kind of be those leaders to kind of show the work that they're doing. This is one thing that I've found to be very, very successful in an organization, is having this, regular lunch and learns, or, in this case, online webinars, as we are now in a remote first world, or having, when you're able to have little mini conferences, maybe a DevOps or cloud native conference, so that people can really start to understand who in the organization are actually doing innovative things. How were they able to get around some of the common roadblocks that you might have in an organization, like the security team or the architecture team and things like that. And then it gives the organization somebody to go to start to ask questions around how were you successful? How can I be successful? And giving the guidance that they need to actually have other teams be successful as well.
Yeah, that knowledge transference is especially important. And oftentimes, when organizations make those opportunities available, whether or not they're in person or on webinar, you still have a couple of holdouts that don't see the value in those opportunities. They're more focused on accomplishing their job. And
It's fine, Emily.
sorry about that. I'm not quite sure what's going on. But basically, they're more focused on their job at hand, moving the mission forward, making sure that they get that commit done in time. And it's up to the organization's leadership as well as the team members to encourage those individuals to actually attend and go. While it might not be directly relevant to the individual project that they're working on, they might have that aha moment. And that aha moment, for as long as it lasts, maybe it's 5 minutes out of a 1 hour session, can actually help them on their next project or help them approach a problem in a very different way. If it's not even related, it could be something like, I don't know, ephemeral identifiers and Bluetooth devices, for instance. May not necessarily be directly relevant to anything that they're working on, but the research and the thought process and the explanation from a speaker about what their project was and how they were working on it, it might trigger something in that individual's brain that can help them be successful. Or somebody comes to them next week and says, hey, I have this problem, how do I solve it? And they're like, aha, I was just watching a webinar on that, I can answer your question.
Yeah, that idea of intellectual stimulation is very important, and I think we tend to forget that, while a conference talk may not be completely relevant for us 100%, there are things that you can pick up and things that you can learn, and the more that you can kind of stimulate yourself intellectually like that, the better you'll be when you go back to your work and trying to solve the problems that you're trying to solve, because you do have that intellectual stimulation. And of course, when we do things live, we do have hiccups like that. So hopefully, neither one of us get another phone call.
Yeah, let's hope not.
So, kind of switching gears here, and this is one thing that I know that you and I have talked about before in the past, but DevOps has been around for a long time. It started around 2008 timeframe. A couple gentlemen, one by and the name of Andrew Clay Schaefer, and who I work with now at Red Hat, and another gentleman by the name of Patrick Dubois, met at the Agile conference, I believe, in 2008, and decided that they needed to have this idea of agile operations. And then out of that was born this idea of DevOps. And DevOps has taken many different shapes and many different forms, or at least has attempted to over the years. We've had things like enterprise DevOps that's appropriate for large scale enterprises, and that's kind of died off, and people have realized that DevOps is appropriate for large scale enterprises. We've had things like rugged DevOps and other things like that as well. But DevSecOps has really started to have this momentum behind it the last maybe 3 or 4 years. And from your perspective, Emily, what do you think is fundamentally different about DevSecOps as opposed to kind of the foundational principles that DevOps put out there, 12 years ago?
So I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I have strong opinions about this, as do many people.
I have strong opinions about it as well, but mine are more on the negative side.
Well, perhaps we can meet in the middle.
Okay.
I'm a firm believer that I don't care what you call it, as long as you're doing it, we're good. So if you want to call it DevSecOps, and that is the way that you get your management's buy-in and your leadership's buy-in, and you can have those communications to make sure that your team is successful, let's call it that. But
Yeah.
me personally, it's DevOps. And by the very nature and the practices, the 3 ways and the 5 ideals, it is secure. And if organizations are implementing DevOps and they are leaving out security professionals and business professionals and QA professionals and fintech and all of those things, then they miss the underlying foundations of why DevOps is important and why it can be successful to those teams. And whenever I have this conversation, I usually recommend you should go back and read the Phoenix Project and probably go back and read the Unicorn Project, because those are essential. You don't want to have your security person coming in the middle of the night with a crisis because they were left out of the loop. You want to bring them along and have the journey together.
Yeah, which is definitely one of the core tenets or thesis behind the Phoenix project, having that security person along for the ride. Of course, the security person was kind of the more traditional type with the binder of the checklist. But you mentioned the 3 ways and the 5, what were the other thing?
Ideals.
5 ideas. So please, for those who are listening and aren't familiar, would you please expound on those, the 3 ways?
Yeah. So the 3 ways of DevOps are systems thinking. That's the first one. And then the second one is amplifying feedback loops. And then the third one, if you give me a minute, I'm pulling up my notes on this because I just wrote a paper on it. And the last one is, well, let me see. There it is. Culture of continual experimentation and learning. So those are the 3 ways of DevOps. And if you're able to implement these in order, you can't start at level 3 if you haven't done 1 and 2 first. Your team is on the right track to continue moving forward. But just doing those 3 things and being successful in that area, while it will get your team to that high velocity state, it is certainly not going to be the 100% perfect solution. And you have to adjust it for everybody on your team and everybody within your individual organization. And that's really where the 5 ideals come in. So the first one is locality and simplicity, moving the work to where the developers and the operators are and making sure that it's not a pain for them to be able to do their job. The second one is focus, flow, and joy. You want to ensure that they have a non-interruptive path to do their job and that they're actually enjoying what it is that they're doing. They're not grunting or sighing anytime that you've asked them to do something because you've made it so simple through the first ideal. The third one is improvement of daily work. And a lot of this comes through iteration. You'll get this through amplifying those feedback loops and the culture of continual experimentation and learning. The fourth one is psychological safety, and this is especially important as a lot of people are working from home nowadays. You need to ensure that your employees, your developers, your operators, security, like the entire list of technologists that you have, are completely comfortable coming to your leadership team or to others on their team with work it is that they're doing. If they're unsure about something, or if they feel that the direction that the team is moving in isn't the right one, that they feel empowered to have those conversations. And the last one is customer focus, because ultimately we're here to deliver better products. Whether or not you're working in industry and you have customers that are paying you money, or if you're working in government or the federal sector, where your customers are either our citizens or our partners in industry, or even the people that are sitting next to you, because ultimately your team is going to be one of your customers. You need to focus on them. And that's really the 3 ways and the 5 ideals.
Great, thanks. And one that I always like, that I go back to a lot, is this idea of systems thinking. And I think many individual contributors just think of that little role that they do in the organization, and they don't step back and have this broader view or this broader vision. And then another thing that I like about systems thinking is it allows you to introduce tools to help you get this broader, bigger picture. There's some great tools that you can use that come out of lean, and the idea of lean manufacturing. One of which is value stream mapping, which allows you to map out an entire value chain to see how something is produced, and it works just as well for software as it does for manufacturing something like a bicycle, because at the end of the day, software is a manufacturing process. And so the value stream mapping is very important to find out where those bottlenecks are. And then another one is, and I always get this wrong, but I think I finally have it right, but A3 exercises. And the A3 exercises really helps you look at a process and a system to really start to understand what are your goals for it and what you're trying to achieve with it, and where you can go from there.
Yeah, systems thinking is especially important. You can't get anywhere if you don't understand your end-to-end processes. And we're not asking people to like understand how they fit in the entirety of the organization. We're asking them to look to their upstream and look to their downstream and start there and figure out how it is that their work product, whatever it is that they're producing, whether or not it's a software development product or if it's a report or a business financial document, any of those things, look where you're getting your data from, and then look where it's going to. Are you putting it in a format that everyone downstream can ingest? Is it readable? Is it actionable? All of those things, that's what's fundamental. And then once you get your left and your right, or your upstream and your downstream in place, go beyond that and trace where it is that your product is going. Why is it taking so long for you to hear back from somebody? Perhaps it's stuck somewhere. Is there a way that you can help them?
Yeah, there's in my early days, I did performance and capacity planning, and one of the things about performance and capacity planning, or one of the sayings in that field, is that you never remove a bottleneck, you simply move it. And so, if you as an individual contributor don't have that system level view of the world and that idea of systems level thinking, and you just optimize your process, then all you've done is move the bottleneck somewhere else, either further down or further upstream in the process or in the chain. So we've talked about this idea of DevSecOps, how it might be a little bit different, but it probably isn't. And maybe we're just calling it that so that we can get buy-in from management, which I think is great. I do think that there is a little bit more focus of having a security first approach in DevSecOps. And that work that you do in those 3 ways and those 5 ideas kind of lends itself to thinking about security first a little bit more and really thinking about the idea of things like your continuous delivery pipeline and the gates that you're putting in place in those continuous delivery pipeline as being the controls that we used to have in the binder, but now they're automated through that continuous delivery pipeline. What do you see organizations doing in that continuous delivery pipeline to having those gates? I think a good example that we can think of is Capital One and what they've done around their continuous delivery pipeline. They've published a lot of work around that as well. So I would encourage anyone who's listening to just do a quick Google search for Capital One continuous delivery. But from your perspective, Emily, what do you see successful groups doing around your continuous delivery pipeline and putting in gates as controls in that pipeline for a DevSecOps pipeline?
So it's funny that you mentioned that. A lot of people don't realize that the 3 ways of DevOps actually map to this NIST cybersecurity framework, almost one for one, actually. So identify and protect as systems thinking, detect and respond is amplifying feedback, and recovery is continual experimentation and learning. And I bring that up because a lot of people seem to focus on DevOps and automation just at the pipeline itself. And that is where you can catch nearly everything. But you've also got to go a little bit further left in the process. So you're not just shifting left, you're expanding your scope left because you still have to monitor everything and make sure it's doing what you said it was going to do. But instrumenting all of that binder of security controls and checks and the compliance parts of it too, that it's not just the security controls that you have. Individual organizations, whether or not they're in government or industry, have compliance requirements or legal requirements that they're complying with. And a good way to check for those things is through the pipeline. And not only making sure that the builds that are successful are passing those checks, but ensuring that the places where you're deploying your software are enforcing that it came from a trusted source, that it's been signed, that it's been attested, and that it's allowed within the environment. Those are key. So it's not just the pipeline, it's where it's going. And then if you move that a little bit further upstream, there are other ways to catch these things. So your pipeline really becomes your enforcement to make sure everything else was good. Ensuring that your developers are using IDEs with security plugins so that they're getting that feedback faster, that it's local to where they are, ensuring that the libraries and the packages that they're bringing in have been reviewed, making sure that you know what it is that you have, because everybody's got their own business needs for why they need a particular library to do a specific thing on a special fancy project. And that's fine, but having knowledge of what it is and what its expected behavior is key to ensuring and understanding your risk posture later on down the path when you're looking at your production workloads. So doing those gates at your pipeline, ensuring that your developers have the security integration with where it is that they're actually working. And when those builds fail because a check didn't pass or a test didn't pass, making sure that they get that information back. Your security professionals should be working with your developer teams to help develop some of those regression tests. That way, repeated things that keep coming up that you're fixing and you're pushing out to production automatically become tests.
Yeah, and it's one idea to shift it left into the developer's hands and into the IDE, but I think it's also very important to start to understand that as you take the systems view and this idea of feedback loops and fast feedback loops, this can also shift security, well, not shift security, but improve security in production itself, because you can start to get fast feedback loops when something breaks or when there's a vulnerability or when behavior in your environment starts to become abnormal in some sense, right? There's a lot of tooling around there, around in the cloud native world these days to help you really start to understand behavior in the production environment as well. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit as well around how event-driven operations can really kind of start to help with that.
Yeah, it's a lot of organizations, especially within government, are metric starved, as one of my colleagues likes to say. So we have a tendency to like get really excited about a product, and this is probably seen in industry as well, and you deploy it and it's great and it's running, and then all of a sudden something bad happens and you have no visibility into what it is that's going on and where it's occurring until you log in and start exporting logs. And that is one of the worst things that we can actually do, is enable our teams to log into production systems, because then they're already changing the state and we don't want that. What we want to do is encourage, when we're doing these deployments, that we have enough instrumentation, service level tracing, monitoring, that we don't need to log into those boxes. We can look at them in a dashboard, that the logs are going somewhere else that we can dig into and do that root cause analysis on it. We want to ensure that we have enough information to resolve those issues. And if for whatever reason we have a bad actor that gets into a container or into a piece of compute, that we have enough trust in our known state that we can destroy it, and that those logs from the event were going elsewhere. And if you're in a position where destroying that object isn't good because you either need to catch them or you need to trace them back, that you have enough mechanisms and enough capabilities within your deployments that you can isolate and move whatever that component is that's become malicious.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that idea of somehow being able to isolate that malicious actor so that you can then go and do post-incident analysis on it is very important. You know, these cloud native architectures and continuous delivery and DevSecOps, they all sound well, it sounds like it's just a bouquet of roses all of the time, right? But what are some of the challenges in terms of security that these cloud native architectures bring, and what are some of the things that people should be thinking of as they move towards this model to deliver digital first?
Some of the biggest problems is making sure that you've got all your bases covered. And I say that with respect to that security first focus. A lot of teams are gung ho about implementing DevOps and doing cloud native and playing basically buzzword bingo with all of the fabulous words that they eventually want to have on their resume for the next great gig. But ultimately, it doesn't work if you're not bringing the rest of your team with you, those security professionals. Um, Individual organizations may have specific policies or process inhibitors that will stop that effort from being successful. And if you're not tackling those things first, that were set up for heritage architectures and legacy system capabilities, and addressing the problems there, it's going to become significantly harder. If you're part of an organization that is so fixed on collecting specific data points that no matter what, you have to report on those, and you have not adjusted the reporting either mechanism for collection of those data points, or that your security professionals don't understand your underlying technology and where you're going, like IPs may not be a thing for your product anymore, but that's what they're so used to. Because for the longest time, they can walk into a data center and look at a rack and be like, here's the host name, here's the IP, we're good to go, it's all there. That's not going to happen. So until you start having those conversations with them and get them to understand that, tell them that you're not allowing SSH logins by a human to your production systems, and that will blow their mind, or letting them know that no, we're not actually logging into the boxes and patching them, we're just redeploying a compliant and patched product. That alone is a struggle for a lot of people to get there. So when you're doing these and you're making that digital first transition, you have a lot of legacy and a lot of heritage ecosystem around you that you need to bring along, and you have to tackle them one by one. And like you said before, it's going to be kind of like moving that bottleneck around. Once you get one out of the way, there's going to be another one. But eventually you're going to get to that point out of all of those gates where you can kind of take a big sigh of relief and be like, we did it, we're successful. And at that point, there will be a new tech refresh, and then we won't be doing containers anymore. We'll be serverless, and you could have the conversations all over again.
We
But
get
the
to do it
idea is,
all over again.
yeah, we are continually iterating and making things better for whatever the next generation of technology is. And that is especially key, that whatever you're doing when you're going down these paths to be successful and you're charging forward, you're not making it your specific use case unique, that you're thinking forward for other things, because you don't want to get into a position where you have a very specific product that's running on this instance of Kubernetes, and that is what you have pigeon-toed yourself into. You don't want to be there. You want to think about, well, what does the next iteration of my project look like, and how does this change affect that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And you made a couple good points. And one of the ones I want to jump back to is this idea of one, it's a long journey. I think for many organizations, it just starts to seem kind of daunting and overwhelming. Um, but I would say to those organizations that baby steps and start finding ways to make small incremental improvements, and then that you start to have that snowball effect. And the other thing that you kind of touched on is this idea of legacy systems or systems you have to bring along somehow, right? That you're not necessarily going to be able to bring into a cloud native model. But I think the ideas of DevOps didn't necessarily start in the world of cloud native. They started when we had VMs, and we started around this idea of ephemeral instances and how do you leverage the economies of scale of cloud and other things like that as well. And there's plenty of things that you can do around infrastructure as code, automation, reducing toil, making sure that things are monitored properly, making sure that people don't need to log into a machine to actually check the logs, that logs are streaming back to a centralized location, monitoring and metrics, as I kind of already mentioned, and having those available, having the ability to destroy an instance and bring up a new one that's patched and compliant. All of these principles and ideas aren't required for you to be using containers or the latest cloud native technology. So I think it's very important that as organizations go through this process, they kind of inventory um, their assets or their applications and understand how far will they be able to modernize that particular application. What's the ROI for modernizing that particular application and doing those things like infrastructure as code and these DevOps practices and principles? And then what are the things we can actually move to a more cloud native model and having them running containers on Kubernetes or OpenShift or whatever it might be.
Yeah, you made 2 points. So the first one I want to jump back to is evaluating the product and making sure that it's good ROI to make it cloud native. There are going to be cases where you find a product and nobody's really using it. Or it's been around long enough that you've got a couple of people using it, but they're using it in a way that it wasn't originally built. So if you come across that and you're looking at converting it to cloud native, maybe take a step back and ask the question is, do we still really need this product? Why is it
Maybe just
why
maybe
is
just
it still
turn
being
it off and
used?
see if anyone starts screaming, right?
Yeah, just kick the power cord. But it's really is why is it still being used? What need is it serving by the users that it does have? Because it may be one of those things that you're just like, sunset the project and let's start fresh with whatever their needs are. You will also probably find that in the course of identifying these applications, that other teams have built external tools to be able to interface with them just to do things. And because that product no longer has a sustainment team, you've got individual developers just making it work, which is problematic. But the other thing that you touched back on, and I want to bring that up a little bit, is when you're going through all these changes and the path is really long, you can expect people to start to burn out. So you need to be looking around you as your team and as your organization is going through these processes and recognizing who the champions of those efforts are and looking for other people to follow along behind them. Because burnout is going to happen. No matter how sunshine, rainbows, and daisies we try to make this whole process, it's hard when you're constantly going uphill, pushing that rock. And we want to ensure that the individuals that are championing those efforts have a good support system around them, but recognizing that occasionally they will have to take a step back and someone will need to step in to continue to push that rock.
Yeah, and especially when you're trying to push against the inertia of the organization, and people in the organization that want to say, well, this is how we've done it the last 20 years, and constantly putting roadblocks in your way. I've been there myself. Burnout is real, and I think it's a conversation that we're starting to have more of in the technology community. And I think managers should be aware of, but also I think individual contributors should be aware of as well, not only for their own individual mental health, but also for their peers, and being on the lookout for that with their peers and understanding what those signs are of burnout, and how you can help your teammates get through it and recognize that they need to take a step back and take a break. Um, so we talked kind of about the challenges around cloud native architectures, around kind of moving towards this digital first type model. What are some of the things that cloud native architectures make really easy? And I think uh, why everyone's so excited about them, especially in this world of DevSecOps.
Um, it doesn't always make everything easy, for one. I mean, it's a lot of knowledge. We're talking a huge ecosystem to get to cloud native. And if you look at the definition of cloud native from CNCF, it's fairly long. But some of the things that overall it makes it easier is knowledge transference and sharing is strongly encouraged. Um, get if you're doing it right, so this is all caveated with if you are doing it right, if your team is being successful, you've got it makes cultural transition a lot easier because you're more open to change, and change is happening faster for your organizations. um, Under being able to swap and interchange components becomes a lot easier, especially if you're working through API driven architectures, so that those services are not reliant on a specific host or a specific internal capability, but that you can plug and play those different aspects of your architecture. If something isn't working for you anymore, well, what's the next best thing? Let's get that deployed and plugged in. And it becomes easier not only because you're looking through API exchange, data exchange or service exchange, but you've also got the pipelines in place to make that rollout significantly faster. I mean, it could be to the point where you're just dropping stuff in a bucket somewhere and a pipeline is kicking off and it magically appears in production. We're talking that's like push button kind of magic. That certainly becomes easier, and you've got all the documentation and you've got the code written somewhere. Other things that makes easier, because automation requires so much documentation, audits can sometimes be easier because you can, if somebody comes up and asks you a specific question about what happened at this point in time, or you're doing a forensic investigation, you can point back to the image hash that was deployed in production. You can go back to the actual code that was implemented at that point in time. We're getting closer to the point where we can have identical deployments if an incident were to occur, so we can understand the behavior of what allowed it to happen. Though these things are getting easier, but they're also getting harder because it's new technology and we have to take a step back and learn it, and then we have to secure it.
Yeah, and with technology advances, there definitely becomes challenges. A couple of things that I'm probably more excited about, and when it comes to the cloud native architectures, and this is definitely in line with this idea of APIs, right? Like Kubernetes is built around this idea that everything is an API and everything is interacted with via an API. The other thing that I like is it's definitely I would call it infrastructure as code first, although we've kind of had to bolt on the idea of infrastructure as code through the use of things like Git, the idea of GitOps being the de facto standard for infrastructure as code in a Kubernetes world. But because everything is described as a YAML document, it now becomes much easier to make sure that it's stored in source control. And as you dynamically change your infrastructure, then that Git repository is changed and everything can be updated. And the other thing that I like is that this idea of zero trust networks starts to get a lot easier. The ability to have the CNI plugins or the cloud native networking interface plugins to where you can very explicitly say that this particular application or this particular service or this particular pod is only ever able to talk to this other pod and only ever receive traffic from this other pod. And that ability to describe that relationship in the deployment declaration for that application, I think, is extremely, extremely powerful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's actually probably one of the things that gets a little bit easier with cloud native is implementing that zero trust architecture, having service identity management. I mean, secrets management is always going to be hard, no matter where you are. But I feel like we're getting better at it and we're getting closer to really nailing that. But being able to identify a service and trace it back to where it came from, under making sure that both your client and your server can establish a chain of trust, that it's not just some rando in your cluster. Those are all starting to get easier. And as more products become cloud native or more teams move to cloud native, they're identifying gaps in the ecosystem and they're starting to fill them for not only themselves. I mean, we're all selfish. We want to solve our own problems first. But if we are having that problem, in all likelihood, somebody else's. And it is only to our benefit to make that available so that they can help us solve the problem.
Yes, so we're just about here to the end of our time. Emily, any final closing thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
I think the only thing is security is not a dirty word. I keep saying that. But realistically, your security professionals, get to know them. They're people too. And if you're a security professional, go talk to your developers, go talk to your operators, go talk to your business folks and understand what their needs, wants, wishes, and desires are. It'll just make your understanding of what it is that they're doing so much easier.
So communicate is what I hear you say.
That's right.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank you again, Emily, for joining me. It's been a great conversation, as it always is when we talk. And also I'd like to thank you, our audience, for tuning in. This full webcast is recorded and you'll receive a link to watch it again in your email inbox later this week. Keep an eye out and feel free to pass it along to your colleagues. Thanks again, Emily, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.